Hey everybody, this is a piece from the anthology Karl Marx's Life, Ideas, and Influences, a critical examination on the Bicentenary, edited by Shaibal, Gupta, Marcello, Musto, Babak, Amini. And the piece is titled Fetishism and Exploitation, Marx at 150, Marx 200, What Has Changed? By Paula Rauhala. 1. Introduction. Quote, Marx's critical theory of fetishism has become a central point of reference for a, quote, modern, end quote, understanding of Marxism, which is represented by, among others, intellectuals who wish to distance themselves from the antiquated dogmas of, quote, traditional Marxism, end quote, end quote. Jan Hoff, a proponent of the contemporary German new reading of Marx, Neue Marx Lektüre, probably the most popular Marxist approach in Germany today, wrote in 2009. I really recommend Jan Hoff's book, Marx Worldwide, and also his essay, Marx in Germany, which is on this channel. This position raises an interesting question. Why does the emphasis on fetishism differentiate between a, quote, modern and a, quote, antiquated reading of Capital? The modern reading to which Hoff refers dates back to around 1968 and is especially connected to the Frankfurt School. A glance at the literature that appeared in Germany at the time of the centennial anniversary of Capital, 1967, and on the 150th anniversary of Marx's birth, 1968, indicates that readers of Capital who follow the critical theory of the Frankfurt School typically perceive the concept of fetishism as key to the book. In East Germany, the fetishism theme was not as central in the most important readings of Capital at the time. Later, the leading East German expert on Marx's use of this concept, Thomas Marxhausen, even once made the pun that some West German authors fetishize the concept of fetishism. Many valid reasons justify the increasing interest in reading Capital through the lens of fetishism in the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1960s. This chapter presents the argument that these reasons were not pertinent in the East at the time and were no longer relevant at Marx's Bicentennial in 2018. In this chapter, discussions on the centennial anniversary of Capital and the 150th anniversary of Marx's birth in 1967 to 68 are considered, as are discussions that took place 50 years later, in 2017 to 18, prompting the question, what has changed? It will be argued that an interpretation of Capital that emphasizes the concept of fetishism answered the problems encountered by its West German readers in the late 1960s much better than a more traditional reading in which Marx's theory of surplus value plays a more prominent role. The interpretation of the 1968 generation of the Frankfurt School is, however, still popular today, 150 years later. The argument presented in this chapter is that some of the key ideas of this approach to Capital are becoming more and more anachronistic as the world has changed from what it was in 1968. There are a number of possible explanations for why a reading of Capital that focuses on Marx's theory of fetishism made more sense than a more traditional reading in Frankfurt during the 1960s. The first and most obvious is that it follows in the tradition of Western Marxist discussions on alienation and reification. Unlike the first generation of the Frankfurt School, this generation of their students, inspired by the publication of Grundrisse in 1953 in the GDR, German Democratic Republic, embraced capital as Marx's main philosophical work rather than viewing it primarily as a study in economics. Instead, they thought capital contains a much broader social theory. This is probably partly because most of the readers of Capital in the West were philosophers or sociologists, whereas in the East, most of the economists were considered competent commentators on Capital. This fact may seem trivial, but the reasons for this state of affairs are connected to the fundamental differences between West and East German societies. Another reason why the focus on the concept of fetishism in Capital made sense in Frankfurt in the 1960s is that Marx's theory of fetishism was applied in the West German context to both forms of modern industrial societies, that is, capitalism and state socialism, at least implicitly. Thirdly, the fetishism theory offers an explanation for the ongoing question of Western Marxists. Are workers still interested in overthrowing capitalism? This question was especially urgent in West Germany during the years of the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, an exceptionally long period of economic growth after World War II that benefited not only owners but also workers. The theory of fetishism brings to the forefront the structural effects of the capitalist market economy. The real relations appear in inverted forms. The system of class exploitation appears as an egalitarian market system in which individuals pursue success in the sphere of equality and freedom. In 1968, the Federal Republic, it seemed that workers who were relatively well off had taken this appearance more or less for granted. The rebelling students' theoretical role model, Herbert Marcuse, even announced on the podium of the Free University in West Berlin at the height of the student revolts in 1967 that workers were no longer able to see the destructive nature of the system which offered comfortable unfreedom. Only outcasts and intellectuals were able to see the real relations. During the past 50 years, which separate the Marx Jubilee of 1967 to 68, and that from 2017 to 2018, the world has changed. After decades during which a challenger to the capitalist system still existed, global capitalism is now returning to business as usual. The shortening of the workday in the West has stagnated since the 1970s. Footnote. See Christoph Hermann, Capitalism and the Political Economy of Work Time, end footnote. Income inequality has increased. See Anwar Sheikh, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, Crisis. Also, the link between productivity growth and the growth of real wages has been broken. Even in Germany, the link between the increase in labor productivity and the growth of real wages has been severed since the 1990s, and the level of inequality between the rich and the poor has increased. See Oliver Nachtwey, or Nachtwey, I don't know how to say it. Germany's Hidden Crisis, Social Decline in the Heart of Europe, translated by David Fernbach and Lauren Ballhorn, published by Verso in 2018. For these reasons, the main argument of Marx's Capital, that capitalism is a system of private profit-making by exploiting wage labor, rather downplayed in the Neue Marx Lektüre, is today much more relevant than it was in 1960s West Germany. Therefore, in contrast to much of the Frankfurtian reading of Capital, today a more topical reading of the book appreciates fetishism as a crucial concept of Marx's critique. Yet, according to this reading, the concept of fetishism can only be understood correctly in connection to the theory of surplus value. Section 2. The 150th anniversary of Capital and the Bicentennial of Marx's birth, 2017 to 18. The reading of Capital, formulated by the students of the first generation of the Frankfurt School around 1968, was still popular in Germany on the 150th anniversary, and of its publication and on the bicentennial of Marx's birth in 2017 to 2018, and it has gained popularity elsewhere in the world. This reading does not consider the imperative of profit-making at the expense of wage labor as the most important aspect of Marx's analysis of capitalism. Rather, it finds the key insights of Capital within the first chapter of the first volume, in the analysis of the commodity in which Marx does not yet comment on wage labor and capital. Indeed, this reading connects Marx's theory of fetishism primarily to the topics of the first three chapters, that is, commodities and money. Unlike in the reading defended here in the Neue Marx Lektüre, the essence of capitalism is not found in bourgeois class relations, but in commodity production and the fact that labor produces value in the first place. In the words of Michael Heinrich, probably the most notable follower of the Frankfurtian tradition of reading Capital in Germany today, the problem of capitalism is, quote, the rule of value over humans, end quote. Politically, it follows that the goal is not primarily overcoming class exploitation and capital as an objectified form of bourgeois class relations, but overcoming the various forms of, quote, impersonal domination, end quote, that is, commodities, capital, and the state. Heinrich motivates his reading with a critique of traditional Marxism, quote, the simple idea of traditional, quote, Marxist political economy, end quote, centered around labor and exploitation and heavily relying on the false falling rate of profit, cannot help very much to understand contemporary capitalism, but a, quote, critique of political economy, end quote, centered around, quote, form analysis, end quote, fetishism and a monetary theory of value and capital can help very well, end quote. Heinrich. Another influential reader of Capital who contrasts his own reading to traditional Marxism is Moishe Postone. Being a student of Irving Fetscher, the political science professor at the Goethe University of Frankfurt from the early 1960s until the late 1980s, Postone is probably the most eminent proponent of the Frankfurtian reading of Capital in the Anglophone world. In Postone's reading of Capital, the target of Marx's critique is not class domination, that is, the private ownership of the means of production and the exploitation of wage labor. Rather, the problem of capitalism is the form of social labor itself, the fact that labor produces value as abstract social labor. According to Postone, quote, the system constituted by abstract labor embodies a new form of social domination. It exerts a form of social compulsion whose impersonal, abstract, and objective character is historically new, end quote. Postone, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, a reinterpretation of Marx's, it doesn't finish, but I think it's the Marx's critical social theory, I think is the end of the thing, but it cuts off. Yeah, as a side note, there's a distinction, this is just a side note for me, there's a distinction definitely to be made between Michael Heinrich and Moishe Postone, especially on the grounds that Heinrich, as opposed to Postone, highly emphasizes money and the market as necessary conditions for value as a relation between human beings to become manifest. Whereas Postone, at least to my memory, maybe I'm misrepresenting Postone, really downplays the market and money in conceptualizing value. And I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but that seems to be true of Oh, no, I don't want to say that. I don't want to go too far. That seems like an exaggeration. The other thing is that other people who also accept Pistone's and Heinrich's reading of Capital, such as Werner Bonafelt, highly emphasize critique at least Pistone, especially for downplaying the role of social conflict, class struggle, and more recently, human suffering in the cold movement of these impersonal abstractions. So there's heterogeneity within this general kind of thing that's being critiqued. Just a side note from me. Consequently, the working class should not seek the abolition of the appropriation of unpaid surplus labor by the owning class. Instead, it should aim to overcome the, quote, value-creating labor, end quote, itself. This is because, according to Pistone, it's a reading of Marx, quote, social domination in capitalism does not, on its most fundamental level, consist of domination of people by other people, but in the domination of people by abstract social structures that people themselves constitute, end quote. Fetishism instead of exploitation is the key concept of Marx's book because capitalism is characterized by, quote, self-generated structural domination, end quote, which, quote, cannot be fully grasped in terms of class exploitation and domination, end quote, but rather as, quote, a historical dynamic beyond the control of the individuals constituting it, end quote. In the more traditional reading of Capital defended in this writer, the specificity of a society in which the capitalist mode of production is dominant compared to other class societies is that the appropriation of surplus labor is mediated by the market and therefore is not observable and not personal. Like in all other forms of class society, the workday of a worker is divided into necessary and surplus labor. In capitalism, however, the distribution of the product of both parts of the workday among the working class and the owning class, industrial capital, money-dealing capital, commercial and landed property, is mediated through market mechanisms. The value added appears in the fetishized forms of wage, profit, commercial profit, interest, and land rent. Therefore, fetishism is a crucial concept and it is present in all three books of Capital. The fetishism of commodities and money are just the beginning of the story, and after the fourth chapter of the first volume, the concept of fetishism is always related to surplus value and to the mechanisms of its production, circulation, and distribution. Unlike this reading, in which the essence of capitalism is explained by the concept of capital and wage labor, for Pistone, quote, Marx seeks to grasp the core of capitalism with the categories of commodity and value, end quote. Hence, if we follow Pistone's reading, it follows that Marx would present his critique of capitalism already before presenting the transformation of money into capital and before demonstrating how the division of the workday into necessary and surplus labor is, under bourgeois relations of production, reflected in the monetary categories of wage, profit, interest, commercial profit, and land rent. The political implications of Pistone's reading is that the primary goal should not be overcoming the system of class exploitation based on the appropriation of surplus labor, but overcoming, quote, value, end quote, altogether. In a more traditional reading as defended herein, the essence of capital cannot be found in the first chapter of Capital, and the political conclusions drawn from the book are related to the bourgeois class relations and not to the existence of value, commodities, and money as such. Side note for me, it's important to note that Michael Heinrich's book, Introduction to the 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Capital, is about the 3 volumes. It's not just about the first 3 chapters prior to the chapter on the chapters on capital. The Frankfurtian reading of Capital has influenced contemporary readers of the text in the Anglophone world. Among them is Peter Hudis, who writes that Marx's, quote, primary concern is with the way social relations in modern society take on the form of value. His main object of critique is the inverted world character of social relations in capitalism, where human relations take on the form of relations between things. There is little doubt that Marx's critique of capitalism centers upon a critique of value production, end quote. As noted, this interpretation of capital, which identifies commodities and money, and fetishism escorting these forms as the main target of Marxian critique of capitalism, has its roots in West Germany around year 1968. In coming sections, it will be argued that 50 years ago in West Germany, there were good reasons to emphasize Marx's theory of commodity fetishism instead of the theory of surplus value, and to emphasize impersonal domination in Marx's theory instead of class rule. It's important to note also that in Heinrich, he repeatedly speaks of impersonal class rule. Not just impersonal domination to abstractions that are not mediated by conflicted production relations. Anyway, these are reasons embedded in the specific context of reading Capital in divided Germany around 1967-1968. The next section will provide an overview of this peculiar historical situation. 3. Centennial anniversary of Capital and 150th anniversary of Marx's birth in East and West Germany, 1967-68. In 1968, Germany was divided into the GDR and the FRG. The settings for Marx and Marxist research in both states were very different. The year 1968 marked a historical break in both German states and also for the research on Marx and Marxism. What is common in both states is that Marx's work became more readily available during the Jubilee. The years preceding 1968 had been so politically interesting in both states. With regard to the years preceding 1968 had been also politically interesting in both states. With regard to the argument presented in this chapter, the most important factor in West German society at the time was the rise of the student movement, while in the East the most important events were de-Stalinization and economic reforms. In GDR, Marx belonged to the official canon of the socialist state, which professed a Marxist-Leninist ideology. This meant not only that Marxist research had plenty of resources, but also that the Socialist Unity Party, Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, SED, interfere with the research, which made genuine research difficult. East Germany is, however, especially interesting for research on Marx, and increasingly so from 1967 on, when editorial work on the historical critical edition of Marx and Engels' work, Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, Mega, started in East Berlin. The project, which Stalin had suppressed, was continued on the centennial of Marx's chef d'oeuvre. On that day, September 14th, 1967, the organ of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Pravda, and the organ of the SED, Neues Deutschland, announced that the Institute of Marxism-Leninism in Moscow and the Institute of Marxism-Leninism in East Berlin would continue to work on Omega. The darkest years of Stalinism were over. New volumes would not appear before 1975, but during the 1950s and 1960s, serious research on Marx's work, Marxian economics, and Marxism were revived. Also, the 41 volumes of Marx Engels Werke, MEW, which first appeared during the Karl Marx year in 1953, were completed on the sesquicentennial of Marx's birth, May 5th, 1968. Another factor enforcing the revival of credible scientific research and relatively free and critical discussion on the Marxian political economy was the new economic system, a promising reform program of the socialist economy during the 1960s. The NES spurred not only practical but also theoretical debates on fundamental problems of Marxian economics, Marx's method and interpretations of capital. In West Germany, the Cold War atmosphere, not in the form of communism as in the East, but in the form of anti-communism, presented challenges for Marxist research and for dealing with Marx's ideas in an academic context. During the 1950s, the country had only a few Marxian academics until 1968. Few of Marx's works had been published in the West. This situation changed during the 1960s. What was important for the Marx research in Frankfurt was that during the 1960s, Irving Fetcher, I have a video of Irving Fetcher's on the channel. He has a book that's like a Marxology that I would like to read someday. But anyway, what was important for the Marx research in Frankfurt was that during the 1960s, Irving Fetcher published a student edition of Marx and Engels' text. Fetcher, known for his critiques of Soviet Marxism, was a professor of political science at the Goethe University of Frankfurt and Moïse Pistone's teacher. One of the volumes of Fetcher's student edition contained the first section, quote, Commodities and Money, end quote, from the first edition of Capital. This text became important for new readings of Capital among the younger generation of the Frankfurt School, given that Marx's presentation of the value farm and commodity fetishism differs in this first edition from the subsequent commonly used editions. Michael Heinrich reports that this text was seen as, quote, the missing link between the Grundrisse and later editions of Capital, end quote. The Marx Jubilee of 1967 to 68 made Marx's works more available not only in the East but also in the West. In 1967, on the 100th anniversary of Capital, an edition of the 3 volumes appeared. Europäische Verlagsanstalt, EVA, published a licensed edition of Capital by East German Dietz Verlag. At the same time, the Grundrisse appeared for the first time in the West, and later theories of surplus value. The Jubilee was the formal reason for the publication of Marx's original text, but another reason was the increased demand for those texts among radicalized youth. It's interesting. I was under the impression that the theories of surplus value were drawn from, were produced by Karl Kautsky in at the turn of the century. So I was under the impression that those would already be in German. And perhaps that would be obviously the original manuscripts, I believe, from like the early 1860s might have been new, but it didn't seem like the theories of surplus value were new, unless these were new editions of what Kautsky had already done. And I'm not exactly sure about this. This is me taking a guess, but I believe theories of surplus value was more or less a creation of Kautsky, but I'm not exactly sure. the ostensible, fourth volume of Capital or whatever. Anyway, the Jubilee was the formal reason for the public. The Jubilee was the formal reason for the publication of Marx's original text, but another reason was the increasing demand for those texts among radicalized youth. Frankfurt was not only the stronghold of the Marxist critical theory, but also from the mid-1960s the hub of the, quote, anti-authoritarian wing, end quote, of the student movement. The reading of Capital, emphasizing fetishism and impersonal domination in Marx's critique, came into being in close proximity to this group of students and young researchers. I suppose at this point, in the late 60s, there's already the development of the not-so-anti-authoritarian wing of the German student movement that embraced, third worldism and Maoism and shit like that. In 1968, university students changed the whole of West German society, but especially shook its highly elitist university culture. The appearance of what is nowadays called the Neue Marx Lektüre is highly connected to these events. Hans-Jürgen Karl, who was a student of Adorno, was politically and theoretically the leading figure of the movement in Frankfurt, as Rudi Dutschke was in Berlin. Karl was not only a political figure, but also one of the most important representatives of the new philosophical readings of Capital. The background for the rise of the student movement was, as Georg Fulbert explains, the short supply of fresh labor power in the FRG after the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. After World War II and until 1961, the miraculously growing economy of the FRG benefited from educated labor streaming from the east to the west. After erection of the wall, the sudden increased need for highly qualified labor opened the doors of the academy to the children of non-academic parents. These students encountered a conservative university culture and the rigid, undemocratic structures of the university institution. This generation of students relaxed the academic culture. They revolted outside universities by opposing the emergency laws, the Notstandsgesetzgebung, the Vietnam War, and the bourgeois media embodied by the Springer Press, the Springer House, which was central in stirring up negative attitudes towards the protesting students. I felt like I was going to make some comment. But yeah, that's been my understanding of the erection of the Berlin Wall, was at least, not to justify it or anything, but I think the rationale of East Germany was they had a substantial problem about brain drain. Qualified professionals just leaving the country. At the same time, the meaning of being academically educated changed. Before World War II, university students in the most educated countries, Germany, France, and Britain, accounted for no more than, quote, 1/10 of 1% of their joint populations, end quote. By the late 1980s, quote, in educationally ambitious countries, students formed upwards of 2.5% of the total population, end quote. Eric Hobsbawm, Age of Extremes, The Short 20th Century, 1914 to 1991. The Federal Republic of Germany was among the countries where the number of university students multiplied by 4 to 5 from 1960 until 1980. This meant that children of the middle class or even of working class families gained access to the West German Academy. This partly explains the shift among academic students from conservative attitudes to leftist attitudes. Even if the anti-authoritarian wing of the West German student movement had assumed the typical West German anti-communist attitude, as Wolfgang Abendroth put it, the lasting result of the happenings of the year 1968 in West Germany was the end of official anti-communism and anti-Marxism. The Communist Party of Germany, Kommunistische Partei Deutschlands, KPD, was legally banned from 1956 onwards. In 1968, the state canceled the ban on the KPD. Dealing with Marxism was no longer, quote, a cardinal sin, end quote, as Adorno had described it in 1962 in his lecture on Marx's critique of political economy. This is the context from which the new reading of Capital emerged. The concept of fetishism in the reading of Capital around 1968. Although he taught many students, Adorno himself did not write much about Capital, but he made good use of the concepts of Marx's critique of political economy, such as commodity fetishism ideology and the idea of real abstraction. Many of Adorno's students came to emphasize these themes as well. Ernst Theodor Moll explains, quote, in an exclusive tutorial at the beginning of the 1960s, Adorno explained to me the section on fetish and the subject-object inversion which follows from it in such a way that I was subsequently able to avoid taking in economistically foreshortened perspectives on Marx's critique of capitalism, end quote. Similarly, Jan Hoff explains that, quote, according to bracket Hans-Jürgen and bracket Karl, Adorno's legacy was the transmission of the consciousness of emancipation characteristic of the Western Marxism of the interwar period through his specific reference to the categories of reification, fetishization, mystification, and second nature, end quote. Jan Hoff, Marx Worldwide. An excellent book. Another student of Adorno, Hans-Georg Backhaus, later noted that, quote, essentially, all of my writings deal with one and the same theme, the problem of fetishism, end quote. Why was the concept of fetishism so central for the young generation of readers of Marx from the Frankfurt School? Why is this concept supposed to make a difference between, quote, a traditional, end quote, and a, quote, modern, end quote, or a, quote, non-dogmatic, end quote, reading of Marx's mature work? In one important event in the context of the student revolts in the fully packed Auditorium Maximum at the Freie Universität in West Berlin in 1967, Herbert Marcuse explained that the one-dimensional society had managed to integrate the working class. According to Marcuse, the only opposition left consisted of intellectuals, hippies, and outcasts. Only these groups were able to see behind the thoroughly bureaucratized order which was repressing the majority of people by satisfying their needs and creating more and more false needs. Similarly, a key question for Marcuse in his talk at the summer school in Korčula, I don't know if I'm saying that right, it might be Karsula or Karkula, in 1964 had been, quote, why should the overthrowing of the existing order be a vital necessity for people who own or can hope to own good clothes, a well-stocked larder, a TV set, a car, a house, and so on, all within the existing order, end quote. Marcuse, Socialism in Developed Countries, in Marxism, Revolution, and Utopia, collected papers of Herbert Marcuse. Also, in One-Dimensional Man, published in 1964, which appeared in a German translation by Alfred Schmidt in 1967, Marcuse traces the reasons for the diminishing revolutionary potential of the Western working class. As Marcuse put it, people seem to, quote, find their soul in their automobile, hi-fi set, split-level home, bracket, and bracket kitchen equipment, end quote. Marcuse and those following him suggested that workers were not able to see the true nature of the system. What, quote, system, end quote, does Marcuse actually address in his critique? It is interesting that Marcuse more or less explicitly targets his critique at both systems, capitalism and state socialism. An indication of this is that he also applied the terms, quote, industrial civilization, end quote, and, quote, industrial society, end quote, more often than the word, quote, capitalism, end quote. Marcuse claims that, quote, technology serves to institute new, more effective, and more pleasant forms of social control and social cohesion, end quote. Then the, quote, totalitarian tendency of these controls, end quote, is, quote, creating similarities in the development of capitalism and communism, end quote. This is a, quote, comfortable, smooth, reasonable, democratic unfreedom, end quote, which, quote, prevails in advanced industrial civilization, end quote. Instead of the satisfaction of true needs, industrial society offers, quote, repressive satisfaction, end quote. Hence, one possible interpretation of Marcuse's assertions is that the real social relations remain hidden in both forms of industrialized and consumerist societies. As Douglas Kellner explains in the preface to the second edition, the book was, quote, taken up by the emergent New Left as a damning indictment of contemporary Western societies, capitalist and communist, end quote. I have a long essay. Actually, you could probably consider it a book. By Douglas Kellner, to introduce the collection of Karl Korsch's work titled Revolutionary Theory. Anyway, claiming that the workers were alienated in their comfortable everyday existence can, of course, also be criticized as patronizing, as if the radical students or university professors who came from middle-class families knew better what the workers should aspire to. From today's perspective, it seems likely that the continually rising standard of living shortened weekly work hours, and relatively good working conditions in both German states did, after all, satisfy many true and vital needs of wage workers. Even if Marcuse traces some real developments, not all of the working class was satisfied, especially in France and Italy. Revolting students joined forces with striking workers. In West Germany, common struggles of students and workers were not so common, despite the economic recession which had set in by 1966. One reason might have been, along with the relative weakness of the West German workers' institutions, as Wolfgang Abendroth explains, the students', quote, Adornian, end quote, language. It is not easy to draw practical conclusions from Adorno's Marxism, and Adorno himself warned against doing so. As Alex Demirovic puts it, some of those who wanted to turn theory into practice reasoned that practice equals confrontation with the police. As Adorno predicted, those who drew such an extreme conclusion often got disappointed and therefore became turncoats later. The distance between the Frankfurtian students, the forms of their practice, and the workers might explain in part why Marx's description of how things are not as they immediately appear appealed to the followers of the Frankfurt School much more than a reading in which class conflict is seen as apparent. Adorno was an influential teacher of the students. In the transcript made by Adorno's student Hans-Georg Bachhaus of Adorno's lecture on 1962, the ideas of fetishism, real abstraction, character mask, and second nature play a prominent role. In Adorno's reading of Capital, the main problem Marx deals with is the constitution of economic facts. Whereas neoclassical economics aims at a mathematically precise description of established facts, Marx's critique instead reveals the mechanisms that constitute these facts in the first place. For Adorno, exchange is a process of abstraction which does not take place in thought but in social reality. The parties of exchange, whether they are conscious of it or not, reduce use values to their labor values during the process of exchange. Thus, they conduct a real abstraction, a conceptual operation in reality. Footnote. Adorno, T.W. Adorno, on Marx and the Basic Concepts of Sociological Theory. End quote. End footnote. This abstraction is a result of people's own actions in the market, and yet they encounter it as a coercive external reality, which becomes more violent the less people are conscious of its operation. This abstraction also makes the relations behind the things appear as properties of these things themselves. This is not just an appearance, it is not a question of false consciousness. The structure of social reality is such that consciousness really is determined by being. Individuals are at the mercy of the market forces. Adorno does not present, however, a circulationist model of, quote, the commodity economy, end quote. He emphasizes that not only products are commodities, but labor power also is sold as a commodity. Workers are free to change from one employer to the other, but in any case forced to sell their labor power and to give away unpaid labor to the capitalist class. A contract without the compulsion to perform unpaid surplus labor is not an option. Capitalists, for their part, are also at the mercy of external forces. Capitalists do not have personal reasons to strive for profit. Capitalists do it because they carry the character mask of capital. Fetishism and the impersonal form of domination are at the center of Adorno's reading of Capital. What about the East German readers of Capital? Did they represent, quote, the traditional reading, end quote, in which the concept of fetishism was neglected? At least it is safe to say that East German readers of Capital did not neglect this concept. Footnote. As also Jan Hoff emphasizes, especially the research carried out on a few years later by an East German researcher of the Mega Project, Thomas Marxhausen, is still worthwhile for anyone interested in the development of the concept in Marx's thought. Yeah. What was I going to say? I believe that Michael Heinrich also gives credit to certain East German theoreticians that were operating concurrently with the Neue Marx Lektüre. For example, Walter, I don't know, see how you pronounce this. Hopefully I can I don't know, for some reason Adobe Acrobat, and just actually my PDFs in general, don't allow me to like copy things from them consistently, you know? Like it's like they're kind of like, it's not like I'm like blocked from them. It's like just like the program's not letting me, because sometimes it'll let me do it and sometimes it won't. Let's see. Nope, it's not. But anyway, for example, Walter Tuscherer, in his book Bevor das Kapital entstand, 1968, claims that the concepts of commodity and money fetishism offer the key to understanding Marx's theory of value. However, Fred Ulsner, an important politician and the head of the Institute for Social Sciences at the Academy for Social Sciences of the Central Committee of SED, Akademie für Gesellschaftswissenschaften beim ZK der SED, writes in his preface to the book that the author in places overemphasizes the importance of commodity and money fetishisms in Capital. Ulsner also refers to the examiners of Tucherer's, I don't know if I'm saying it fucking right, doctoral thesis, who criticized the same point. Tucherer's book is certainly one of the most important East German books on how capital came about. Later, one of the most important figures of the Frankfurtian student movement and of the new readings of Marx, Ernst Theodor Moll, calls the chapter of Tucherer's book that traces the development of Marx's theory of fetishism, quote, admirable, end quote. This is because it, quote, avoids the economistic foreshortening characteristics of previous discussions in the East, end quote, and instead highlights, quote, the qualitative, socially critical aspect of Marx's doctrine of value, end quote. See Ernst Theodor Moll, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland in Karl Marx's Grundrisse, Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy. 1 second, please. Tucherer's book appeared in the GDR during the Karl Marx Jubilee in 1968 and was published simultaneously in the Federal Republic. The book probably influenced the new readings of Capital in the West as well, as did probably another important book, The Story of a Great Discovery by Vitaly Vygotsky, translated from Russian into German in the GDR to honor the centennial anniversary of Capital in 1967. The book deals with Marx's different manuscripts during the course of his research from 1850 until 1863. In the beginning of his book, Vygotsky notes that Marx overcame the fetishism, in addition to the empiricism and ahistoricism, typical of the bourgeois political economy very early, by explaining that the objective appearances of human labor are essentially forms of the appearance of the relations between human beings. In Poverty of Philosophy, Marx, quote, formulated the most important theses of his economic doctrine. The relations of production are not, as in the opinion of bourgeois economists, relations between things, but relations between people with reference to things, end quote. Vitaly Vygotsky reminds readers. The Vygotsky's Story of a Great Discovery, I think, is an important book that I should probably read. Thus, Vygotsky by no means ignores the centrality of fetishism in Marx's critique of political economy. However, even if the concept of fetishism gained some attention in the East German discussions, the Frankfurtian way of elaborating on fetishism was a distinctively Western phenomenon. Section 5. An encounter between East and West. In a talk at the conference organized for the centennial of Capital, 100 Jahre das Kapital, in Frankfurt am Main, the translator of Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man and Adorno's assistant, Alfred Schmidt, presented an influential interpretation of Marx's method in Capital. According to Jan Hoff, quote, Schmidt's paper represents a kind of, quote, birth document, end quote, for what was a new phenomenon in post-war Germany, the intensive and sophisticated engagement with the critique of political economy, end quote. Given that the Neue Marx Lektüre is known as a distinctively Western way of reading Marx, it is noteworthy that in the context of Schmidt's presentation, an interesting discussion between Schmidt and an East German delegate took place. This discussion helps to examine why the concept of fetishism was so central in the West, and at the same time perhaps caused some unease in the East. The conference was an exceptional event in the sense that the organizer, the Institute of Political Science of the Goethe University of Frankfurt, headed by Irene Fetscher, had invited a very heterogeneous group of Marxist and non-Marxist researchers, among them an official delegation consisting of the top political economists of the GDR. Schmidt's reading of Capital differed fundamentally from the East German reading of the work. For Schmidt, a sense of all of Marx's categories is critical. The laws of the political economy are an expression of such a society in which people do not yet control their own social forces. Schmidt explained that the objectified appearances of human labor are products of our activity, forming a coercive objective second nature. Different from capitalism, in communism there would not be any forces or conditions existing independently of us, Schmidt announced. In other words, the philosopher claimed that all of the categories researched by Marx, commodities, money, capital, and wage, emerge from our own separate and non-reflected actions and belong exclusively to capitalism. Then, under socialism, Capital, the book, would be a useless book. From Schmidt's perspective, dialectical materialism was by no means an ontological hypothesis of the structure of reality, but instead a description of the state of affairs in a capitalist society, in which thought is determined by being. People face the objectified appearance of their own labor as independent forces, and their own actions result in the laws of the economy reminiscent of natural laws. Schmidt also expressed the same idea in a collection of essays titled Folgen einer Theorie, which appeared on the Centennial of Capital. Economic determinism applies as long as humans do not control their own societal forces. Ingo Elba sums up Schmidt's conclusion. Marx's message was not an automatism of liberation, but liberation from automatism, an irrational mode of socialization. I have some pieces from Ingo Elba on the channel. Karl Bichler head of the Department of Political Economy of Socialism in the East German Academy of Sciences, criticized Schmidt's basic premise, saying that as an aggregate result of the intersecting actions of individual economic actors, certain economic laws emerge. This is why we need to sit in this conference, Bichler quipped. In other words, for him it was clear that laws and forces are independent of economic actors still existed not only in capitalism but also in state socialism. Why did Alfred Schmidt's reading of Capital seem so problematic to Bichler? In the Eastern Bloc, every student of political economy had to read Capital, even if the book was not read as a manual for a planned economy. Most of Marx's categories and laws were considered specific to capitalism, but some very general laws were thought to operate in socialism as well. In the official celebrations of Capital organized 2 weeks earlier in East Berlin, the head of state, Walter Ulbricht, ascertained that the laws included the law of value, the law of economy of time, and the so-called law of congruence of the forces and relations of production. The Stalinist Walter Ulbricht. And it seems like important. It seems, to my understanding, I mean, I'm not an expert on the topic, but it seems that East Germany was one of the most repressive and authoritarian states within the Eastern Bloc. Yeah. The law of value was considered to apply because some means of production, most of the raw materials, intermediate goods, and consumption goods were produced as commodities for exchange. Unlike in capitalism, even if the products of labor appeared as commodities and money, the utilization of the commodities and money as capital was to be prevented. Still, the law of value, it was believed, had not lost its validity. However, commodity-money relations were considered subordinate to the socialist relations of production, whereas the determining characteristic of commodity production is the anarchistic regulation of social production ex post, via the functioning of the law of value. In the state socialism, it was considered the task of the central planners. By the 1960s, however, it had become evident that the economy was not under the control of the central planners, partly because they had to base their decisions on incomplete information. Companies did not always give correct information to the central planners because it was not in their own best interests. This is because the directors of the companies wanted to secure as many resources and encumber as few obligations for their companies as possible. The interests of the companies and of individuals did not coincide with the interests of the rest of society, quote, yet, end quote, as was often added. Hence, the relations between producers were not transparent, so to say, which was one of the challenges of centralized planning. The problems related to the diverging interest and incomplete information given to planners were among the most important reasons reform was needed, which GDR realized in the form of the new economic system launched in 1963. New economic system aimed to improve the productivity of labor, the utilization of raw material resources, and the system of planning by introducing market elements in the form of enforcing monetary categories, increasing the independence of companies, and providing economic incentives. Against this backdrop, it is easy to understand why Bichler criticized Schmidt's presentation. From Bichler's perspective, in a complex modern society, certain economic laws emerge from the actions of individual producers and consumers. The task of economics was to understand and make use of these laws for the purpose, that's emphasis is mine, use of these laws for the purpose of achieving political goals. Getting these laws under control was not a simple task, nor was the abolishment of such laws in a complex modern system of production and exchange. Schmidt's answer to Bichler's critique was that Bichler wrongly considered the objectivity of the laws of political economy as a positive aspect of capital. The objectivity of these laws was the object of Marx's critique. Once one should not fetishize in theory what is already fetishized in reality. Schmidt also got support from Oscar Necht, another important Frankfurtian theorist who insisted that the scientific naturwissenschaftlichen concepts, meaning the objective laws of the economy in Marx's work, have to be understood with their disappearance in communism in mind. Hence, one aspect of the disagreement could be that Marx's concept of fetishism, not so much fetishism of capital, but fetishism of commodities and money, enables a critique of the Eastern reading of Marx and of some aspects of the state socialist society. Ernest Mandel, who explicated such a critique in the conference, Mandel inquired of Bichler whether fetishism, alienation, and ideology necessarily escort the state socialist variant of commodity production. The abolition of commodities and money was surely far from the reality of the GDR at the time. The country was struggling with much more concrete and acute problems. However, the critique presented by Western Marxists is interesting from the perspective of both theory and practice. With regards to social reality, state socialism seemed to be far from how Marx had envisaged post-capitalist society. A top-down order and lack of democracy and freedom of speech characterized the state socialism of the 20th century. In addition, the state socialism seemed to share some core values with Western capitalist societies of the time. In both systems, productionism and consumerism reigned. The workers did not have control over production and were offered a subordinate role in the workplace. Consent of the top-down order was bought with the promise of a rising standard of living. Consent for the top-down order was bought with the promise of a rising standard of living and increasing possibilities to consume. In this respect, Marcuse's pairing of the two systems traces something interesting, even if his poetic critique does not offer a precise analysis of either one. From the perspective of Frankfurtian readers of Capital, East Germans seem to fetishize the socially specific economic forms, such as commodities, money, profit, interest, and wage, and laws, such as the law of value presented by Marx in Capital. In the opinion of the Frankfurtians, Marx used these categories exclusively in a critical sense, including the categories of commodities and money. In the postscript from the editions of the conference publication 100 Jahre Kapital, Walter Euchner and Alfred Schmidt write that economists from East Germany formulate Marx's critique of political economy as a positive theory of economics, and therefore the critical sense of Marx's project tends to get lost. In the same spirit, the quote father, end quote, of the Neue Marx Lektüre, Hans-Georg Backhaus, claims later that as Marxism-Leninism understood Marx's political economy affirmatively as a positive political economy, it functioned as a legitimation of the new system of domination. Different from this, critical theory understands Marx's critique negatively as a critique of fetishized forms. In other words, for the East German economists, it was clear that state socialism was essentially a commodity-producing society. For the Frankfurtians, instead, the term, quote, socialist commodity production, end quote, did not make any sense. Just as a side note, the Neue Marx Lektüre people were not the first socialists by any stretch of the imagination, including to suggest that socialist commodity production didn't make any sense. As readers of Capital, Bichler and Schmidt operate in very different social realities. The questions Bichler and Schmidt sought to answer with the help of the book were different. In the East, economists were mainly considered competent commentators of Capital, whereas in the West, Marxian theory was rarely studied in economic departments. While Bichler was interested in finding solutions to the practical problems of the state socialist planned economy, Schmidt was not at all concerned with such issues. Moreover, the Cold War drove the perspectives of each side ever farther away from each other. The mainstream of East German reading of Capital was grounded on very specific historical circumstances and on the practical problems of a centralized planned economy. Similarly, reading Capital in the context of the 1968 generation of the Frankfurt School and the anti-authoritarian wing of the student movement was peculiar. For the radicalized students, reading Capital through the concept of fetishism made much more sense than a more traditional reading. The historically specific societal conditions of the divided Germany during the years of the Cold War are, however, no longer current. Therefore, it is time to reconsider both readings, including the now dominant Western interpretation. As a side note, one of the major influences on this reading of the contemporary, this ostensibly dominant Western interpretation of the critique of political economy, it largely has its genesis in the works of Isaac Ilyich Rubin, the Soviet economist, who was not a Western philosopher in the Cold War era. And his influence on what is said here to be the now dominant Western interpretation can't be exaggerated. Even if he wasn't quite as important for the initial, whether or not he was important for the initiators of the Neue Marx Lektüre, he's important for this dominant value form interpretation of Marx's critique of political economy. Section 6. Conclusion. There were many good reasons for the emphasis on fetishism, second nature, and real abstraction in West Germany around 1968. First, in the FRG, the readers of Capital were not economists, but philosophers acquainted with the, quote, Western Marxist, end quote, discourse of alienation and reification. Even if Marxist theory entered the West German Academy during the 1960s, mainly the social sciences and humanities departments tolerated it. Second, Marxist theory of fetishism, not related to capital and wage labor, but to commodities and money, offered tools for the critique of both forms of the, quote, industrial society, end quote, capitalism and state socialism. Third, and most important for emphasis on fetishism, might be that around 1968, students arose as an independent force in society. Their revolutionary mood clashed with the objective conditions of the working class. Until the late 1960s, there had been a long period of growth, and not only capital, but also labor had benefited. The globally, quote, regulating capitals, end quote, that is, the most competitive capitals were, in many cases, located in West Germany. These companies could pay much higher wages than the companies in other countries were able to pay. In such exceptional historical conditions, focusing on the problem of fetishism was for many radicals more interesting than focusing on the theory of surplus value. These reasons are less weighty today because the move to shortening of the working day has stagnated, the connection between the growth of productivity and of wages has been broken, and the welfare state is under attack. A more traditional reading of Capital, focusing on the theory of surplus value, provides better justification than the reading of the 1968 generation to explain why the length of the workday is a question of life and death for the representatives of capital today. It seems to me that the idea isn't of the Neue Marx Lektüre wasn't to disregard the concept of surplus value. I don't think that doesn't seem um, appropriate or fair to me. It seems like the impetus of it was to critique the more deeper, basic level categories, what the value critique, like people like Robert Kurtz, who are not discussed here and I don't know much about, but I think it's a nice terminology that they use, the terms of esoteric and exoteric Marx, in referring to the early chapters of the critique of political economy. The idea wasn't that surplus value production and the battle over working days, or relative surplus value, or any of those kinds of an absolute surplus value, or subsumption of the labor process under capital were unimportant, or in terms of, or like that seems like something obviously anyone who has to who engages with the critique of political economy has to consider. The idea was to dig into this deeper level, to my understanding at least, of whether of the most fundamental, basic, constitutive components of a capitalist mode of production, such as money, such as commodity production, such as value. Um, and I don't think that it doesn't seem to me that it's fair to say that they just weren't interested in surplus value production, or like maybe they weren't as interested in it because it's fair way infinitely more straightforward to follow the critique of surplus value and exploitation than is the notion of the fetishism of forms. Um, Also, they're trying to. I feel like uh, in order to differentiate surplus value from other types of surplus exploitation, it is necessary to at first get a theoretical handle upon what distinguishes value from different types of representations of wealth or forms of wealth. Uh, you can have You can have exploitation, very extreme exploitation, without surplus value uh, being the form, or value being the form of that surplus. So it's necessary to get a handle on what value is before you can talk about value surpluses. And it seems like to me that kind of like emphasis on the first three chapters of Capital, um, they weren't like a rejection of a critique of exploitation or whatever. It just, the critique of capital that's laid out in political economy, in the critique of political economy, extends beyond that. Um, yeah. And then I think that also the point that they're philosophers is the philosophers were focusing on this, and not economists, uh, is relevant here because, generally speaking, was this, where did I read it first? Was it in here that philosophers speak about the oftentimes their focus or orientation is to focus on the appropriate starting point for a discussion about any particular topic, and so it would make sense that people trained in philosophy would try to get down into uh, the nitty gritty of the rather the extremely abstract level of analysis for the preconditions of creating a critique of the capitalist mode of production. But who knows? Moreover, what remains to be done elsewhere is to demonstrate that a more, quote, traditional, end quote, reading of Capital, focusing on the theory of surplus value, not only makes more sense in present times, but also is more accurate. The main targets of Marx's critique are bourgeois relations of production and how these relations are portrayed in bourgeois political economy, and not the fetishism of commodities or money as such. Fetishism of commodities and money are, to a lesser or greater degree, present wherever a market exists. Therefore, it might make sense to apply the concept of fetishism of commodities and money to the state socialism of the 20th century as well. Absolutely. Fetishism of capital is, however, another story. Fetishism of capital is related to the specifically capitalist relations of production, the relationship between capital and wage labor. Only in the beginning of the first volume of Capital does Marx talk about fetishism of commodities and money. From the fourth chapter of Volume 1 onwards, Marx discusses the bourgeois relations of production, and from this chapter on, he links the concept of fetishism to the capital relation, that is, to the theory of surplus value, and the theme of fetishism runs through all three volumes. Yes. The problem of fetishism of capital is related to the constant, invariable, fixed, and circulating capital, to the production of relative surplus value, to the wage form, to the yearly rate of surplus value, to the rate of profit, and finally to the commercial profit, interest, commercial profit, interest, and land rent. Thus, what remains to be done elsewhere is to demonstrate the meaning of the concept of fetishism in all three volumes of the book, and how, even if eminently critical, the concept of fetishism gains its proper meaning only in connection to the theory of surplus value. In capitalism, fetishism serves to hide the fact that the source of all value is labor, and thus covers exploitation of wage labor, even if the social relations immediately appear as free and equal market exchanges. I think this is absolutely true, but I would add that it seems like a starting premise for most of the people who engage in this new reading of Marx, premise that have the idea that, and this may be disputed by historians or whatever, but generalized commodity production, where the societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, the wealth appears as a massed collection of commodities. Generalized commodity production and exchange for the market as the intention governing production is something that only gets off the ground once capitalism and all of that entails in terms of surplus value creation and extraction and exploitation also get off the ground. That seems like a premise that they all more or less start from. One of the more interesting critiques of one of the more interesting papers I've read is I forget what it's from. It's from this same book series. It's from the book series of Marx Engels Marxism, but it's the book on Alfred's own Rachel, and it's a critique by Yanis Milios or John Milos or whatever his name is, the one Greek author who writes about the value form theory, and he critiques Zone Ratel for kind of not giving attention that the real abstraction that takes place in a society characterized by generalized commodity production is not something that's characteristic of, say, commodity exchange as such, but commodity exchange as it specifically becomes the dominant mode of social synthesis within a capitalist mode of production, not just within any mode of civilization that happens to have some commodity exchange within it. I would check out that paper if you're interested. It's in I think it's called Marx and Critical Theory, and I think I don't remember who it's edited by. I think it might be edited by a few authors from South America or Latin America that I'm not familiar with, but it has people like Werner Bonefeld and Chris O'Kane and people like that, I'm pretty sure. But that one John Milios critique seems very pertinent. That the law of value doesn't get off the ground as a regulating mode of the general human metabolism with nature until capitalism becomes established, and with capitalism being established entails a conditions, generally speaking, of the generalized condition of there existing a class of doubly free wage laborers who have no choice in gaining access to the means of subsistence than to sell themselves into exploitative labor contracts. So yeah, there's not a much of a distinct. I feel like there's this in this paper. Sorry for talking so much, but it seems like in this paper there's just it's like you couldn't talk about exploitation within the value form paradigm, which is manifestly untrue. Yeah. Some people whose work I recommend on this score, I would recommend the 3 volumes put out by the what's it called? The International Symposium on Marxian Theory, featuring thinkers like Chris Arthur, Riccardo Bellofiore, and Patrick Murray, on the relationship between the critique of fetishism and the critique of form, these capitalist forms, and exploitation. And the books that they wrote are not just about the first 3 chapters of Capital. They're about the entirety of the first volume, but also they have entire books on the second and third volumes that come at these questions from this angle. Or if you just read basically the most introductory textbook to these kind of questions would be Michael Heinrich's Introduction to the 3 volumes of Capital. The whole book, exploitation is featured in that book. Its relative and absolute surplus value are featured in that book. Circulating and fixed capital are featured in that book. Constant and variable capital are featured in that book and talked about extensively. This kind of dichotomy is just, to me, just nonsense. Anyway, getting too carried away here. There are, however, positions in the structure of production and exchange where the social relations are much less covered by the objective appearance of these relations, by the commodity form, money form, wage form, or by the forms of profit, rent, and interest. These positions are the positions of the employer and the employee in the, quote, fierce struggle over the limits of the working day, end quote. As Marx goes through the early legislation restricting the length of the working day, he quotes factory inspectors who talk about, quote, small thefts, quote, small thefts, end quote, of capital from the laborers' meals and recreation time, end quote. Marx comments on this by saying that, quote, it is evident that in this atmosphere the formation of surplus value by surplus labor is no secret, end quote. In the struggle over the length of the working day, the real relations are laid bare. I don't think anyone within the Neue Marx Lektüre would disagree that the working class doesn't, within, especially as it's faced when it's located in the site of production, understands that it has an interest that are diametrically opposed to that of the people governing the production process, just as any exploitative relationship between people who control the means of production and those who are dependent upon them for access to the means of subsistence. I don't think, and the question then becomes is not whether that conflict takes place, but does that content in any way escape, you know, what Lenin, who I assume this person being a fan of traditional Marxism, would hold Lenin in quite high esteem, would say trade union consciousness. Do these conflicts over the length of the working day, over exploitation, do they remain a struggle of right against right, against between workers seeking higher wages and capitalists seeking higher profits, or do these struggles step beyond that into a question of critique of overcoming that conflict between capital and labor altogether in a communist slash socialist relationship being established? I don't think. I don't know. You certainly don't need Marx's Capital to tell you that there's exploitation in capitalism. You can read a primer, any anarchist primer, and it'll tell you that. Or you could talk to anyone who's involved in trade unions or is represented by a union, or anybody who works, to tell you that they try to suck, that capital and employers generally try to suck everything out of you for the minimum amount of return. I mean, you don't need Marx's, you don't need the 3,000 page books to tell you that. Yeah. Anyway, today the struggle over the length of the working day is once more apparent, even in Germany. Marx's theory of surplus value makes much more sense today than it did 50 years ago. No, it doesn't. Surplus value was being created in 1968 as much as it is in 2023 or 2018. Maybe class struggles heightened, maybe austerity and belts being tightened, and neoliberalism being, coming to be the dominant guide for regulating economic policy, creates more tensions within workplaces, but surplus value was still being created in West Germany in 1968 as it is today. His theory of surplus value was relevant then and it's relevant now. It's not like it went out of, just because it went out of theoretical vogue doesn't mean it was made less sense then. In the changed circumstances, the quote traditional end quote reading does not seem quite so antiquated anymore, but instead seems plausible, even common sense. Yeah, common sense. I hate this paper. Therefore, Jan Hoff and other followers as Alfred Schmidt should reconsider the quote antiquated dogmas of traditional Marxism, end quote. The only reason for this is that the antiquated form of society was restored in the decades following 1968. Thanks for listening. I apologize for my rambling, but Christ. I did find that, I'll say this though, I definitely found this paper interesting for its intellectual history. I just disagree with its points. Uh, I don't think, obviously, they step away from, definitely step away from like personal moral critiques of capitalists as people, and or as, which is, and critiques or celebration or valorization of labor. That's certainly true. Um, but what is of value within traditional Marxism uh, stayed with uh, this new reading of Marx. Uh, the critique of exploitation and the critique of surplus value uh, didn't go anywhere, but new insights were added and overcome came pre-existing dogmas uh, that reduced Marxism or Marx's critique of political economy to a radicalized version of Ricardo. Um, um, it doesn't mean that obviously like people should still read people like Rosa Luxemburg and uh, you know Hilferding and Bukharin and people like that and other people that tried to build on Marx's critique of political economy prior to 1968, but the insights that doesn't mean like you know that doesn't mean we should go back and step away from this critique of fetishism um, in order to just focus on surplus value appropriation. But anyway, thank you for listening, and hope you got something out of hearing me read this, and maybe even something out of me talking. Um, I apologize if you were looking to just hear what the thing said, didn't want to hear me ramble, but it kind of came from the gut. All right. Yeah, read Jan Hoff's Marx Worldwide.